And the only way this could be a better treat for me is if we were all somehow gathered in one space. But then again, maybe this would be unlikely to be possible on those terms. So I'm full of gratitude for the company of Stan and Edward and everyone who I see queuing up and chatting and greeting us from Argentina and Los Feliz and Australia and Park Slope and Milwaukee. Thanks for sharing this time with me. I'm really just going to hand it off to Edward to do a little reading. That's the order of events, and then Stan and I will get to talk about the book a bit. And yes, right, there's a great reminder appearing just now in the chat, which is queue up some questions after we indulge ourselves by just talking between the two of us initially. I'll click on that ask a question button and see what's there and pull some thoughts out of the queue. So I'll really be eager for that. I guess that's it. Edward, you've been introduced. Do you want to take it away?
There we go.
Great.
I'm really loving this book and excited to read a portion of it. It's timely, to say the least. So Jonathan and the team there thought that chapters 5 and 6 from the arrest would be good place to dive in. So here's a portion of the arrest. Chapter 5, the arrest, such as Journeyman understood it. Without warning, except every warning possible, it had come, the arrest. The collapse and partition and relocation of everything, the familiar world, the world Journeyman had known his whole life. The future, that is to say, announced itself. The future already present, but distributed unequally like everything else, like bread, talent, sex, like peepal, neem, aloe, and those other plants that give off oxygen at night, like the rare spottisol-rich ground for which Journeyman's sister's farming collective was named. The arrest produced itself as a now already past, like a time capsule unearthed. This was confusing. It should be confusing. Did Journeyman understand the world into which he'd been born, its premise, its parameters, its plot? No. So why should he grasp how it had changed? How even to say when the arrest began? The question was when it had gained your attention. Plenty flew under the radar. Biodiversity halved. That made an impression barely. Polar ice, Miami drowned. Terrible, yet also too big to take personally. One day, Journeyman noticed reports of a new tick-borne disease, one that once you'd been bitten, cow meat made your throat close up. No more American Wagyu tomahawk steak for two, black on the outside, red within. People joked uneasily. Were the new ticks an eco-terrorist hack? On television, someone said that the turning point had been in 1986 when the president removed the solar panels from the White House. Then again, someone else said that the turning point had been when St. Paul's epistle had been delivered to the Romans and ignored. You could debate this shit forever. But not on television. Not any longer. Here the arrest had at last commanded Journeyman's attention. He sat up and noticed the death of screens. They died not all at once, the screens, but in droves, like creatures of the warmed ocean, like those hundreds of manatees washing ashore on the same day in Boca Grande, who just weeks before Journeyman had found uncompelling and deleted from his feed. He'd unfollowed the manatees. No hard feelings. Television died first. Television contracted a hemorrhagic ailment, Ebola, or some other flesh-melting thing. The channels bled, signals fused across time as well as virtual space, like a live Rod Serling Playhouse 90 teleplay broadcast from 1956, sputtering into last agonized life and expiring in the middle of episodes of season 2 of Big Little Lies. The Vietnam War came back, and family ties too, until these boiled and melted along with the rest. The Gmail, the texts and swipes and FaceTimes, the tweets and likes, these suffered colony collapse disorder. Each messenger could no longer chart its route to the hive or returned only to languish in the hive, there to lose interest in its labors, whether worker or drone. All at once, the email quit producing honey. So many other ecologies depended on pollinators, the goings between of the now fatigued drones and workers. Without them, nothing worked. Air conditioning units stalled. Planes fell from the sky. The honey of emails and texts had been the glue holding the world together, it appeared. Now the smart devices all evidenced wasting disease. They had to be put out to level pasture to let them graze out the last part of their lives. There they crumpled to their knees, starved, incapable of grazing. People kept on swiping at the phones and mashing at the keyboards. Some tried to give the voice-activated devices mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Some proposed fixes or workarounds. Those more mystically minded placed phones or remotes beneath their pillows at nights or built shrines in which to surround their devices with crystals, hoping to spark them from their silence. Others, like Journeyman, merely kept glancing at the screens that had gone dark and also sat periodically weeping. Some, like Journeyman, needed eventually to be given a mug of herbal tea while someone else hid their inert former electronic playthings. A solar flare, eco-terror, terror, species revenge, the revolution. Had Journeyman's world jumped the shark? The stars didn't go out one by one. The US wasn't replaced with a next thing. It was replaced by wherever one happened to be, the place one happened to reside at the moment of the arrest, which, after a fitful start, had come overnight. Did they even call it the arrest elsewhere? Journeyman counseled himself to be done with such speculation. Be here now. Wherever you go, there you are. All politics are local. Every bumper sticker had come true at once, even as the cars slumped sidelong from the roads to make way for other means of transit. Every tank seemed sugared by the same prankster. The gasoline turned into a thing that inched from the pump nozzles like molten flourless cake. Guns worked for months, for nearly a year after the initial arrest, then died too, souring like milk. The bullets no longer even blew up if you shattered them with a hammer. Journeyman had seen it tried. Goodbye to gasoline and bullets and to molten flourless cake. Goodbye to coffee, to bananas and Rihanna, to Father John Misty, to the cloud, to new news feeds full of distant core meltdowns, to manatees and flooded cities, and other tragedies Journeyman had guiltily failed to mourn. Hello instead to solar dehydrators, rooftop rain collectors, to beans, kale, winter squash, to composting toilets and human manure, to a killing cone, feather plucker, evisceration knife. Say hello to chasing a screaming duck into a pond to drag it back to the killing cone, to being a butcher's sluice boy. Had Journeyman known that barns were traditionally painted red to disguise the bloodstains? He had not. Journeyman had been playing catch-up since the arrest, cribbing from field guides, farmers' almanacs, seed catalogs, old Michael Pollan paperbacks. Could he become a man of the soil in midlife? No, he was too old a dog for that trick. The peninsula was choked with expert organic farmers lured here by the locavore movement. His sister was one of them. That's why Journeyman worked with the butcher. Augustus Cordell sluicing bloody steel tables, retrieving offal and caul for Victoria's sausage making, Victoria's creations, her summer sausage, her hard salami, her black pudding. They were prized by the whole peninsula, but also used as a barter with the people of the cordon. As it turns out, therefore, Journeyman could wish he'd been carrying a packet of them in his Telluride Film Festival backpack 5 minutes later on the same morning, after climbing the lake's overgrown driveway back to the main road. Chapter 6, an old friend. At first, Journeyman thought it was bees or deer flies, a kind of humming, as he pushed out of the canopy and onto the sun-mottled asphalt. He mistook the humming for the bee-loud glade. This day was still weirdly perfect. Journeyman, free of Cormence's monologue, was interested to search for the book that the prisoner had requested. It had caught his imagination. Journeyman had a little crush, too, on the woman who'd moved into the library, and it made an excuse to visit there. It wasn't bees. A contingent from the cordon was on the roadway. Their humming resolved into something more irregular, the guttering of their night soil engines as they approached. Journeyman distinguished the sound a minute before the riders appeared, hovering into view over the roadway's contour. 2 shit Harleys. Behind them, 2 other men on horseback. The 4 were an advance team for something else, some stormhead rumbling further back down the road. Journeyman stood blinking as they dismounted. He knew one of the riders, who called himself Eek. Was this short for Ezekiel or Ikadiah or some other longer name? Journeyman didn't know. Eek might have been in his late 20s. His hair was slicked back and cut stylishly high on both sides, although he wore a stalactite beard of the cordon elders. Mr. Duplessis, it was the way of the cordon to address members of Journeyman's community formally or mock formally. Eek, for one, spoke with impunity to men decades older than himself, or at least to Journeyman. He picked his nose in front of Journeyman, evidence, if needed, that the formality in his address was more mock than otherwise. Hello, Eek. Just the man I wanted to see. Good piece of luck finding you on the road. It's good to see you too, Eek, but I wasn't expecting you. I haven't got anything. Journeyman still at this point imagined that this might concern sausage or other supplies. This isn't about nothing like that. No. You're good with us, Mr. Duplessis. We wouldn't ask for more than our fair share. Well, what can I do you for? We got a strange one for you. Comes with you and your sister's name attached. If your names hadn't got mentioned, I doubt we'd be here. I don't understand. Well, a fellow came up our way in kind of a car. He waved behind him at the road. The other men were stopped on the motorcycles, and the 2 horses, including Eek's own, seemed to flicker their attention back the way they'd come as well, as if Eek had their sightlines tethered to his hand by an invisible thread. A working car? Eek paused to shake his head, signifying something outside the box. Not like any of us have ever seen. It's big, kind of an armored car. A supercar, I guess you'd say. Later, Journeyman would reflect on how Eek's nomenclature stuck. Supercar. Perhaps the inevitable term. He won't come down from it. He says he'll talk to Sandy Duplessis or Madeline Duplessis only. He also knew the name of your sister's farm out there. And you couldn't get him out of his car? Well, not if we didn't dynamite him out of it, which I can tell you we were prepared to do until he began shouting your name down. Like I said, it's been a bit of a puzzler. We're not afraid of him, mind you. Some proposed turning him back the way he came, but others felt we wouldn't mind taking a look at the operation of this thing if we could get him down from it without dynamite. We thought you and your sister might want to at least give him a hearing before we made the call. Down. Journeyman couldn't visualize this. Also, he was distracted by something that he'd noticed, that Two of the cordon's men bore bandages on their limbs. One, a thick hump of gauze at the juncture of the shoulder and the neck. Had they been in some kind of battle? Were these wounds acquired in wrangling the supercar? Or should Journeyman take their tales of periodically invading hordes more seriously than he had? He's seated up pretty high, said Eek. You'll see. He glanced over his shoulder. Now Journeyman heard it and saw it. Not the car itself, which remained around the bends and below a few rises. Just the rumbling cloud that it raised on a still and sunny afternoon. Eek appeared a bit rattled by the thing that he'd been trying to describe, that thing coming. What were Journeyman's feelings at that imminence, that Tuesday when it first came, before it rounded into view? Was he rattled too? Certainly, but something more. Journeyman felt an abject throb of who he used to be. Someone in a quote-unquote supercar had come bearing his name as his bona fides. Journeyman might be more than the town's emissary to the lake of tiredness. And the butcher's sluice boy. He might be an important person on this peninsula. This man, he really knew my name. Surely there was a trick in this. The dust cloud grew nearer. Otherwise, time had stopped. A crow moved from branch to branch, a blob of shadow on the sun-daubed road. Journeyman could so easily have stayed longer bantering with Jerome Cormantz and missed this strange caravan rolling through. Perhaps then Eek would have implicated whoever else he came across instead of Journeyman. No, your name, Mr. Duplessis. No mistaking that. Did he give his? Eek scratched deep into his beard with strong fingers. Yes, he did. Said Peter Todbaum, and he said you'd know him.
Thanks so much, Edward. I realize that first chapter is full of tongue twisters. That was heavy lifting, but that was great to hear too. Thanks, really, for joining us and doing that.
Pleasure.
So, I mean, I guess I can start just by setting up what you heard a little bit in retroactively. This is a story about a guy who gets stranded after this non-specific collapse of civilization that is called the arrest. Gets stranded on his sister's farm in Maine, and has to make himself part of this community in a coastal town in Maine when he's really not. It's not his normal environment. It's not his natural what the natural way he's come to live as a Hollywood screenwriter type. And a few years into this adjustment, into this placid apocalypse that he's part of, this supercar comes rumbling into the scene, and that's the sequence that Edward just read. And now I suppose, Stan, we should just say I was really lucky to have you as one of my early readers for this book. So you've been living with this material with me for a couple of years since I threw the first long draft at you.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it was a privilege, really, for me, and a pleasure. I love this book. I've read. I think I'll talk to you rather than the audience. I've read a lot of your books, and now it's been decades, right, since we first met, and I've been reading your work, and it seems to me that they have in them. They always have a kind of pleasure principle. There's a playfulness in them. There's a bouncing between the so-called genres. Any one book of yours seems to be strung up between 2 or 3 genres at once and being aware of all of them. In this case, a after the fall type science fiction, but also some kind of political allegory. And I guess what made me love this one was that there is um a growing cheerfulness. If you think of your books as having a kind of political message, then a lot of times it seems to me that your books are saying things that are relatively dark despite the sweet tone. That there's not much individuals can do that works, that doesn't rebound against them and their families. You see, if you read your books in chronological order, you see that tracking downward as if you're on the hunt for something that you can believe in that would work, and damned if in the arrest you don't find it somehow. And I'm speaking very vaguely and generally, but maybe you can tell me if I'm onto something there.
Well, I like the description, and of course, I don't see the books from the outside. I only know how I feel when I'm writing them, and when I look at them, I'm seeing a track record of those feelings. And sometimes books that are taken as quite despairing, I mean, in some cases specifically politically despairing, in one case that I'm thinking of, specifically politically despairing by you, which was Dissident Gardens, I felt was a journey towards a reconnection or a enunciation of the appetite for like a post-capitalist vision of the world. And I was surprised at how much it was taken to be politically dark in the way that you describe. But I also realized that I push hardest against the things that I'm afraid will fail me. That I write about, I do write about things that self-defeat and complicity and the snares of our political appetites a lot. And it's as though I'm reality testing the things I care about the most.
Right.
But I also think that there was something very freeing about the return I made to working with the imagery, the iconography of post-apocalyptic or dystopian fiction with this book, because it allowed me to say, well, maybe I can stop protecting certain things. They're ruined already, or they've been taken away already, and yet here people are still moving forward in some fashion, and what would that feel like? What would that look like? Yeah. So it was a circling back in some ways to the work that I was inspired to do when we first met, and I was reading books of yours, like the ones even before the Mars novels. We were just talking before the show about San Diego, and I was thinking about the meltdown of the San Onofre reactors in not the Gold Coast, but the Wild Shore. Is that the name of that
that's
book?
right.
Which was the first novel of yours that I read, and it was, in some ways, a very gentle post-collapse scenario, and it reminded me that some of my favorite writers, like George R. Stewart in Earth Abides, or Ursula Le Guin in Always Coming Home, Philip K. Dick and Dr. Blood Money, had, in a way, they'd required the destruction of everything in order to get to something sort of a place where they could explore a kind of pastoral utopian or anarchist desire for a transformed world. It's a very high price to pay. And
well, It's a literary price. I think that we use these devices of take everything away, and let's not focus too much on the transition or the arrest, although your arrest is extremely funny and also plausible. I mean, nobody really knows how the internet is running, et cetera. And if it broke, no one would be deeply surprised. And this, it's funny, this after the fall exercise. I mean, Dr. Blood Money is one of Dick's greatest and craziest books. And it's like what you say, it's a pastoral. Same with Stewart, a much greater novel, maybe the greatest one in that whole genre. But I like yours a lot better than mine because of its playfulness and the sense that what you've erased is kind of the bullshit of carbon culture, the internet, the fossil fuel cladding on us, and the disconnect of mediated experience. And now, I mean, I have to say, just as an aside, the fact that there's people all around the world listening in to us right now, there's something great about the connected world that is to be loved, but it's also abstracted and it misses that the daily connections of people face to face that happens in your arrested community in Maine. And Maine is part of this, I think, because it's already there in a way. Um, that there's a call there. Essentially, you could maybe have it both ways. You could make the arrest in your own head and get back to fundamentals in a way where you could use these media when you needed them, but otherwise maybe drop back into a more grounded and physicalized existence. And there's a cheeriness in the arrest that seems to suggest to me that, well, when when the death tree comes back in this supercar from Hollywood, and it's a Hollywood 1950s or a comic book 1930s vision, his supercar, well, this is the threat of all of that world that's been rejected or dismissed coming crashing back in. It could mess things up. So you have your plot. And what I love is that I'm speaking of the allegory, but while you're reading it, like when you talk about being inside it, you read it, it's the surface story is perfectly solid, rock solidly authentic, like you're there, but then you can also interpret it later. And that's a real gift that I think that you have. And it goes right back to your first novel. It's a consistent gift of being intensely real and also intensely surrealistic at the same time. Like you're more real
Thank
than
you.
Phil Dick.
Thank you, Stan.
You're more surrealistic than someone like Charles Dickens. But in these combinations, that's where I think you have your wheelhouse.
Thank you. I mean, your pleasure in this book has made me feel that I wrote the one I wanted to. So it means a tremendous amount. But yeah, right. So I mean, part of what comes back, is the not just the technology and the aggression that the supercar represents, but also the idea of plot, the storytelling impulse itself, which is one of the things that has sort of collapsed in my future. And when you talk about Maine being essential to the book, I think in some way there's something. You and I both spend time there, and there's something about its remove that can make other parts of contemporary reality seem surprisingly distant. Like you say, you can conduct your own private arrest there if you want to, and in a more literal sense, it's one of the places where I've made friends with people who were, like serious peak oil people, and where you might have a dug well and a capacity to grow some of your own food and a knowledge of who in your community could take care of other parts of your existence going forward. And so it's a good place to be a prepper. It's not an illogical place to be a prepper the way, say, if you're digging a sub basement here in the Inland Empire, it's kind of ridiculous because the first thing that won't work is you won't have any water, and you'll be forced you'll be forced out of your hiding place, and you'll be on the run. But so
you'll be like the movie Blast from the Past. But in Maine,
or
I think it's worth talking about your Maine in terms of this drowned coastline, these peninsulas. I mean, our summer places in Maine, by a wonderful coincidence, are 7 miles apart as the crow flies, but it takes a full hour or more to get from one place to the other, because you've got to get off one peninsula, go back way up the drowned valley to inland, and then come back down the other one to get to each other. I mean, we could presumably jump the gap or take a rowboat and be faster. But that allows you, that's another, you have a nice geographical compartmentalization or a space to tell this story that I think is another part of our pleasure in it is your pleasure in that landscape, that Maine landscape.
I do take a lot of pleasure in being there, and it fascinates me in ways that are, some of them are very still childlike. I mean, I began as a New York kid. I began going up to places in Vermont and Maine and the Catskills, and becoming fascinated in a way that I'm still connected to this sort of primal amazement, and I put that, the first appearance of Maine in my fiction is actually in Motherless Brooklyn, where Lionel ejects out of New York City, where he's never left before, the 5 boroughs, and is suddenly on the coast of Maine, and he's just, somatically overwhelmed by the silence and the trees and the shoreline. And there's probably a part of me that's still going through that first encounter. But one of the things, I like the way you talk about how difficult how much longer it takes to drive than it would take by boat to go from where you spend time.
Yeah.
And the coastline there is sort of shattered and fractal at the same time. There are little pieces of the islands, make it unclear when you never really have an open horizon. Everything is a kind of mosaic of little islands. And then if you straightened out the shoreline, it would be thousands and thousands of miles, because it's this sort of, and then if you study it and you go and you walk to the water where you are and you look at the involutions there, it's sort of an unmappable space by definition.
So you have your space there and your community, and I'm thinking now about how you mentioned plot, and it's funny to me that there's really a macro plot in your book, in that you can tell the story of a journeyman and his interest in the mysterious librarian, his attempt to reconnect with his sister, his attempt to understand his sister's partner, and the crazy guy that he takes care of that's been exiled, and his boss. It's like an early George Eliot novel, A Village Life, and it has those interests.
Yeah.
And then when Todd Bomb comes crashing in, the macro plot is to say, we already had a good story going here, and you're crashing our story. And so they kind of sling him out of their story. I don't want to go into spoiler land too much, but people will get it when they read it. There's, again, the over story that you're telling us. There's a hilarious quality to it that is a deadpan, but very funny.
Well, thanks again. I was thinking of this book partly in terms of those novels that have this weirdly elemental physical movement that is the peg that everything hangs on, like As I Lay Dying, where a call.
Uh-oh. Jonathan, for me, you're frozen.
Hang tight, folks. We'll see if we can get him back.
Am I unfrozen and he is? I could vamp for a while.
We can hear you, Stan.
There's a beautiful thing in Jonathan's Motherless Brooklyn when they first go to Maine, the smell of pine trees. I remember that. That was a very well observed, and I'm sure that comes out of his childhood. Yeah, ice also. He froze on Aslay lay dying. Yeah, it's would be people will be writing about Jonathan's books, which is
Hey
maybe
there.
not the best way of being read. But this one will connect up with the feral detective as. In fact, Jonathan, are you back? Can you hear me? Not quite. There's things to be said about New York, a New York writer, fundamentally a New York writer, Brooklyn, Manhattan, who spent a great deal of his life in California, and it gives him perspective. Okay, I think that this is kind of Joyce writing about Dublin from Trieste and Zurich, that once you're away from your true home ground, your true subject matter, then the things that are important about it stand out for you. And it's easier to catch what matters, so that, in other words, Jonathan's New York novels, and I really love Chronic City and Motherless Brooklyn and Fortress of Solitude.
Hi, friends.
These New York books are even better than they would have been if Jonathan had not lived in a long time in Berkeley and now a fair bit of time in the LA basin. So, Jonathan, I don't know if you've been able to hear me or if you can hear me
I
now.
actually been hearing every word. It's like being at my own funeral. I like it. And somebody pointed out I got arrested immediately upon saying the title of Faulkner's novel.
I can see you talking, but I only hear a rapid cluttering. But if you can hear me, I've been talking about how the greatness of your New York novels comes from you having written them out of California, that it gives you better perspective, that the things that matter most for the fiction to evoke New York intensely and vividly, it's a necessary distance to get out of town, to get out of the city, and look at it from across the continent, and that's added to the force of your New York novel. So I've been kind of vamping here, but it strikes me that's
I
a
love
real
it
thing.
all. Oh, good. People are someone saying that I'm coming through fine now. I mean, I have to hope that that's still true. I switched up my approach here a little bit. Sorry to disappear, but as I said, it was sort of like being at my own funeral and hearing a wonderful eulogy. I deserve to be arrested after inflicting it upon all my characters and presumably on all of human civilization. Stan, thank you for vamping so generously. And okay, so there's a few things I want to follow up on. Yes, being what did Joyce say? Silence, exile, and cunning. Well, you can't guarantee the cunning, and I'm no good at silence. I seem to never shut up, but I have definitely arranged for exile for myself. And one of the things that people don't know, and there's no reason they would need to know about the Brooklyn books, is that actually I was rarely in Brooklyn while I was writing about the place. I wrote most of Fortress of Solitude sitting at a cafe in Toronto, where I was living in those years, and kind of dreaming my way back to the city. And I would visit just enough to soak up a little more, replenish the vibe, and then I'd run away again. And I wrote Dissident Gardens, which was all about Queens and Manhattan, when I first came to Claremont to teach at Pomona College. So I've often thought it was best to be in the opposite place. And most of the desert book, Feral Detective, was written in Maine, in Blue Hill. So,
yeah.
I thought up the arrest when I was crossing the country. And the book opened itself up to me, partly because I was making a drive across the space of the country. I'd been living in Maine for a while, for 8 months, and I was driving solo with my little dog. And as I kind of crossed out of the plains and into the desert and mountain spaces, something about pulling away from the coastal Maine environment into the giganticism of the United States. And I think replaying the frontier mythos in some sort of, absurd way, feeling like I was crossing an impossible space and reenacting some of that mythic, journey that I've critiqued and sent up in so many different ways. Thinking about Nathaniel West and Raymond Chandler and the Westerns and so many other things that I knew about California before I came here. But that was when I saw this image come to life for me of the supercar crossing in the other direction. It's almost like reverse engineering the myth of the frontier.
I want to ask you about genre. I remember very early when we met, we were chatting in Berkeley at Blake's, and you said something to me that struck me very strongly. You had already made a big mark in the science fiction field. And for a lot of us, that means you're there for your career. And you said, well, but I remember Ian Banks, the Scottish writer, he's got a flourishing mainstream career, we would call it in the science fiction community. And he's got a flourishing science fiction career. I want to do that too. And I thought, well, it's easier said than done, young man. But then within like a year later, you had done it with, because Gun with Occasional Music is, its relationship to genre, it's a mystery novel, but it's also some kind of a science fiction novel, except it's surreal, symbolic, whatever. It began this thing you've done ever since. A novel will kind of exist, as I say, suspended between different genres that you're very well aware of. Do you think about that when you're writing it, or do you just follow your nose?
I can't really keep from thinking about it. And actually, I think that I was just very lucky in my timing. The reading world was very accommodating in terms of what I was interested in doing. I think that people like our mutual hero, Philip K. Dick, but also people like Raymond Chandler and Patricia Highsmith had kind of tangled with this desire, and it had split them in some ways. They'd had to have a kind of form a reverse "you can't fire me, I quit" kind of snobbishness about the literary life, even as they were obviously writing in full apprehension of larger traditions and connecting. Their work was connected innately to other traditions, as is yours. I mean, the first novelist I remember talking about with you was Joyce Carey. I remember thinking, I felt like I was the only person on earth who was reading Joyce Carey. And
me too.
and I had to go and find you, in the science fiction community to have a good conversation about him. So the replenishing life of reading, the connections that are underlying all of these impulses, and for me were irrepressible. I mean, I wanted my work to connect to all the things I loved. It was really that simple. It was about my appetite and my adoration, my fondness for these things. It was able to flourish in the way that you've described because I talked about it a lot. I mean, the conversation you and I were having at Larry Blake's is where we were sitting. Is that right? That's great.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought of that place in a million years. The conversation was like ready to happen. And I was shameless enough to have it every chance I got. So I wore the aspiration to confuse genre openly, instead of it being a kind of a murky thing. It was I was brandishing it, and so the first book being a very blatant mashup of the hardboiled detective story and and Philip K. Dick and also the brothers Strugatsky, were in that book and some other elements. It became a way to just say, yeah, I know it's a problem. What do you think? What do we do? Let's, I don't know. I'm just going to keep moving forward into this sort of happy crisis of super referentiality. Everything's going to point in multiple directions. Let's see if we can all go through this together. I sort of said that to my readers, and they were precisely, it created its own sense of in a way, a kind of mission that I was on. And but there's another word that comes into it for me, which sounds really like a professor's word, but I'm a professor, so it's okay, which is metageneric. And I think that one of the reasons that word has come back to mind for me, it's not a complicated thing. It's stories that are interested in their own genre, and I do it in different ways, or it emerges at different points in my work. One of the most obvious ones is in Motherless Brooklyn, when the character is a fan of Raymond Chandler and has those books on his shelf and is, in a sense, wondering whether he could qualify as a character in that kind of story. So that the question of whether Lionel Esrog is just a kind of a loser or a dreamer or a fantasist, or whether he's a legitimate enactor of the hard-boiled story from within is actually a live question in the book. And I think that's true again in The Arrest. I think the characters in The Arrest are readers of dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction, and they're disturbed by it and excited about it. And when they see that their world has begun to conform to their fantasies and their vicarious life, they're wondering if they're somehow responsible for the world turning in the direction of their fantasies, and they're wondering what role they might get to play in it, because they've been rehearsing that possibility through their reading life for decades by the time my story begins.
Right. Well, Samuel Delaney is really good on genre being a set of reading protocols that writers and readers share together, so that any given text is in a relationship with these previous texts that set up ground rules. So that for The Arrest, you could talk about Earth Abides, or The Road is a kind of counter example of how to bludgeon the genre to death by a kind of gruesome over literalness or what have you. But Earth Abides is a model of a kind of nobility of starting over and getting down to basics, and a giant prose poem. And so I can see how you're referring to the genre, the meta genre. I hadn't thought of it that way, but it's definitely there for your work. I particularly like the mystery stuff, because I began as a mystery reader, but of locked room mysteries, a particularly closeted and useless subgenre. And it wasn't as useful as, say, Chandler for you, but I do think puzzles are important. And once you have a mystery, you have a plot. And that you can string. It's easier to organize a novel if you have a plot.
Yeah.
And mysteries give you one right from the first page. So it's been enormously productive for you. But I also think you're in a space now of your own that is kind of a high wire trapeze artist, or you're strung up between these genres and can bounce them off each other so that you have a Lethem novel. Uh-oh.
Jonathan, you have frozen again.
There's too much thought for that particular comment. Let me think. Well, this is people came here to listen to Jonathan. I'm just vamping, and so
I've reloaded.
Oh,
Is it
good.
working?
Here he
Good.
is.
Okay. Listen, I'm gonna make a hard pivot, Stan, to the questions because we've left barely.
Yes, go. Oh.
I'm just going to pop back on the screen while Jonathan, we need you to refresh again. I'll go ahead and read the first question while you do that. When adapting for television or film, what are some of the creative ways you can show such rich narration from novels or monologues with no dialogue? And that comes to us from Jessica. And
Hey there.
Read that. So Jonathan,
have I made another return?
Yes, You're back, and I just read the first question out.
Right.
About adapting.
So I'm interested in that question too, but I think it's important to make sure that I'm clear. I've never adapted my own work for a film. And for example, when Edward made Motherless Brooklyn, that was his job from top to bottom. And so I think about adaptation all the time as a film goer and as a novelist whose work sometimes gets put into that framework. But I don't do adapting, and I don't really know anything a lot about it. Although I as a method or as a task, I just know that I'm really fascinated by it. I mean, I like reading, for example, the sources for Hitchcock's films, which are usually so incredibly different from the results, but in a really stimulating way. And you can see what Hitchcock liked in the books that he pillaged for just a few key pieces of iconography or set pieces. And I kind of like that relation when a film and a novel are only obliquely related. Of course, another really obvious example is To Android's Dream of Electric Sheep and Blade Runner, and the way they just sit as two artifacts that speak to each other but are not, there's no, if you're looking for a satisfyingly faithful adaptation, you'll be bitterly disappointed. I don't know if I answered that question at all, but I'm going to keep going because I want to ask you. I want to answer some of these others. Are there any of my other works currently in or planned for adaptation to the screen? That's an easy one to answer. There are a couple of very live projects. Gun with Occasional Music has yet another prospect. It's been developed a number of times, and it's in development. And the one that's really diverting at the moment, and I think they just issued an announcement about it, is that Michel Gondry is trying to do As She Climbed Across the Table, which would be a joy to see because he's the right sensibility for nearly anything I wrote. I'd be excited to see him try to do something with it. There's nothing happening with Conic City, but I love Michael Shannon, and so he'd be a very tall person to play Perkus Tooth. But sure, why not? That sounds good. If you have any influence on Michael Shannon, get him a copy of that book right away. Okay, I'm going to keep looking at the questions. Actually, Stan, you've got one. Do people ask you about the moment in Aurora when they have to decide about quarantining half the population? So Aurora is the great novel that Stan wrote about a generational starship moving from Earth. Do you look at that book differently in light of the experience of quarantine that we've just gone through?
Well, maybe it's so much more extreme in Aurora that I was trying to take the Starship novel, speaking of genres, and smash it like a plastic toy with a baseball bat. So niceties of quarantine have not really come up. There's a whole squadron of readers who quite hate that book, but no, let's move on to the next question.
Oh, okay. Well, I love that book. So it's a strong. Oh, good. Someone's popped it into the.
Yes,
that's a great place to start with, Stan. I mean, there are any number of great places to start with Stan, but
that would be wonderful.
That's a terrific book. Okay, I'm. Excuse me for just darting around here in this question queue. I know there isn't a whole lot of time. I have never read the little golden book called Supercar. We can cross that off the list. But there was a point of reference in children's literature for the car in my book, which is that my father used to tell me these stories. He told me this serial story as a bedtime story about a car called the Blue Streak, which was this kind of superpowered, one-of-a-kind race car that was going around the country having adventures. And so I took the nickname of the supercar in The Arrest is the Blue Streak, and that comes from my dad's Shaggy Dog bedtime stories. Writing about New York City, Stan, you've done it as well. I did when I was, okay, I'm going to riff on this. I was overhearing, and this is coming back to the question of writing in exile or writing about places you've never been. I think there's someone who said that if you want to write about a place that isn't your home, you only need to go there for 10 days. And so you're my inverse. You're a Californian, deeply rooted in the West Coast geography and culture, but you wrote a whole trilogy of novels about New York City. How did you self-authorize? How did you make that happen?
Well, it's just the one book about New York, and that was about all I had to say about it. What I thought to myself was
DC in the trilogy, excuse me.
Yeah, and I lived in DC. But as far as New York, I've only been a visitor, and it's about those 10 days. And I must say, Norman Mailer spent 10 days on Mount Desert Island, and at the beginning of Harlan's Ghost, he nails it. So I think, though, every American has an inner New Yorker, and when I had to start doing The Citizen, it was almost frightening how much he took over and began to rant in a classic kind of Mets fan way. Everybody can hear that voice. I think it's a part of Americana. And I'm always entranced. When I visit the city, I'm just stunned. I am just like a hick from the sticks. My head's craned back. I can't believe what I'm seeing. I'm very excited. And I dearly love it. So I could express that love of the stunned visitor.
Great. Yeah,
it's a writer's trick.
Well, one of the ways to take care of, to kind of create a reader surrogacy is to write about things as if you don't know anything about them. When I wrote about physics and As You Climbed Across the Table, I wrote about it from the perspective of a humanities scholar who found it completely baffling. And in some ways, that was the approach I took to the desert and the Inland Empire in Feral Detective. I wrote about it from the point of view of a completely fresh off the boat New Yorker who found it all perplexing.
Astonishing. Yep.
Yeah. So we must be just about done, but I'm going to try to knock this last one off the list. What was the inspiration for your amazing cast of characters in The Arrest? Well, I mean, I did think about, let me go back to first sources. I started to tell you about how accommodating that Maine landscape can seem to the idea. It's a place where you go and you start to think that the person who's the most like a prepper is probably the most well-adjusted person, the person most in accord with their environment, and in a way, it's a place that doesn't need a before and after the arrest. It's sort of in a timeless state of a kind of qualified relationship to modernity. You might not have a very good internet signal when you're there, and it might not matter. But one of the things that I've grown up thinking, the joke that one makes if you're like me and you grew up as an artist or a writer is that, but you also have an apocalyptic imagination. You grew up watching Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone and reading Philip K. Dick novels is, well, after or Ridley Walker, what will I do? I know what other people will do. They'll try to do some post-apocalyptic version of their jobs. Well, I guess I'm a storyteller, so maybe they'll need the storyteller around the fire. But the real origin point for Todd Baum and Journeyman and their relation to their environment in the book is this joke about how little people would need a storyteller after the collapse, how really useless that person would be. It wouldn't even be sort of like every other week they'd have a fireside talk and they'd say, "Come bring the storytellers to the front. We need to remember the myths of civilization." It would be sort of like, don't do that anymore. Just stop. We really don't like it, and you have to go be the person who sweeps up after the butcher, or be the bicycle delivery man, because we don't want a storyteller here in our village. And because maybe the storytelling was also one of the technologies that they've freed themselves from in the collapse. Maybe they're post story. And that, thinking about how locked in we are to capitalism and technology and other frameworks or ideologies that go with modernity, we are also enthralled, I grew up this way, by the storytelling medium, by what comes emanating out of Hollywood, and the power of the myth making, the way American history is all muddled up with ideological narratives like the frontier imperative and John Ford westerns, and so I just thought, what if this is like a seed of a bad technology coming back to life? The storytelling itself is the problem, and then Hollywood is the exemplar of that.
I must say, between You Don't Love Me Yet and this one, that your work, as much as it seems to love mystery novels, it's not very fond of Hollywood.
Well, I guess I'm going to circle back to the place we began, Stan, and I know we're just about to wrap up, and say I'm also in love with Hollywood. And so again, you see me being merciless or hardest on or reality testing things that I feel enthralled by, or that open up avenues of desire or appetite in me. I want to push against them, and I want to test them because they're also a part of me.
Cool. Interesting.
Well, Jonathan and Stan, thank you both. Edward Norton, thank you also. It's been an incredible evening of performance and discussion. And thank you all for joining us. Make sure you buy this.
Thanks, really, everyone, and so much to Stan and to Edward, and thanks to everyone for tolerating my strange disappearances throughout the evening.
The arrests.
My multiple arrests.
Yeah. Yeah. My thanks. I want to just say, read that book. It's delightful, and it's been a privilege to be on board.
Thanks so much, Stan.
Thank you. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. Let's talk soon, Jonathan.
Great.